Imagine you're a phalarope, Wilson's phalarope. You are a very small, light bird. You can fit in the palm of a human hand, and you weigh about the weight of 2 AA batteries. You start your year at Lake Chaplin, a salt lake in Saskatchewan, and there you lay your eggs, and then you fly to the North American West for the next stage of your migration, when you'll go to a salt lake and eat a ton of food. You decide you're going to go to Lake Abert in Oregon, which is the closest lake to there. You're flying over the Oregon outback, over a lot of sagebrush and grass, ready to see a big blue glistening pool of water that is just buzzing with flies that you will chow down on for the next few weeks. But when you arrive, instead of finding tons of water and tons of prey, you find nothing but a salt crust and a bunch of mud.
The lake was gone, all dried up. 4 times in the past decade, that's exactly what has happened at Lake Abert, leaving no food for these hungry Wilson's phalaropes on their big trip south. Salt lakes are among the world's most threatened ecosystems. Lack of water could lead to many of these lakes permanently drying up in the American West. Caroline Tracey is an environmental reporter who grew up on the sagebrush slopes of the American West, a place that flows through so much of her work. She recently signed a book deal for a memoir about her love of salt lakes, these often ignored ecosystems that are crucial to the world's water cycle, migratory bird populations, and human health.
If you're used to seeing these big, dry landscapes of the American West, it's very striking to come upon a salt lake because they're just glistening blue. They're even actually more glistening and more blue than freshwater lakes because the suspended salt reflects the sun more. So they just create this reflection of the landscape that's really extraordinary. And yet at the same time, I think a lot of people don't appreciate salt lakes because they find them smelly or gross or barren. And so I do think that it's important that the salt lakes have something like the Phalarope to show people that they're not sterile and gross and barren. They actually are really vital and full of life that we can connect to because it's cute.
But it's more than just the cuteness of the Wilson's Phalarope that caught the attention of Caroline. These tiny white and grey birds might just be the key to the survival of these saline environments. There's a movement to get the phalarope listed as a threatened species by the federal government as a way to protect the habitat they need to survive, so that no bird in the future will have that experience of returning to a crusty, barren lakebed. From KUOW in Seattle and Chris Morgan Wildlife, welcome to the wild.
When I was 24, I worked as a cowboy in New Mexico. After rainstorms, the brown-red earth turned white in some places, especially at the edges of the creek that ran through the ranch. I didn't understand where it came from. I only knew that as a queer woman searching for home in a world fast being remade by climate change, I kept finding my way to salt.
Caroline read me this paragraph during our conversation. This passage is from her upcoming book, part ecological exploration, part memoir. Caroline has spent the last few years obsessed with salt lakes, putting down on the page lessons of biodiversity both in nature and in society. I was interested in why she kept finding her way to salt. But first, I needed to get a better understanding of what exactly is a salt lake.
So most valleys have an outlet where a river could drain out and eventually get to the sea. But in arid regions of the world, you find these closed basins where there's never been enough water to cut a valve like that. And so the water just collects and evaporates and leaves behind the salts at the bottom.
But where does the salt come from?
The salt comes from a couple of different sources. Historically, in the Pleistocene era, when the climate was cooler and wetter, there were massive lakes in these what are now arid regions. And so you had much bigger lakes. So where Great Salt Lake today was a lake called Lake Bonneville. Where most of Nevada was a lake called Lake Lahontan. And over time, when the sort of climate changed between geologic epochs, the water evaporated and left behind this much smaller body of water, but the salts don't evaporate away too. So the salt concentration ended up just the same amount of salt, but in a smaller amount of water. So they're salt lakes. And then also year to year, the water that flows into the lakes will pick up some salts from the soil or from the rocks that it passes over to.
You quote an ornithologist that says salt lakes are freakish habitats. Why freakish?
Yes, that was a quote from Margaret Rubega, who conducted some very pioneering research about phalaropes at Mono Lake in the 1990s. But what she was referring to was these are places that are so inhospitable that very few creatures want to live there. First of all, the water is not drinkable by most creatures, so that's unpleasant. They're prone to temperature extremes because they're in these very dry regions. They get very hot in the summer, very cold in the winter, and that means that only a few very highly adapted forms of life make a living there, and their food chain is short and very odd.
Wow. It sounds like another planet in some ways, doesn't it?
Definitely, yeah. And actually, scientists have done some research at salt lakes about life on other planets because they think maybe they're the closest analog to life on other planets.
Oh, that's amazing. Probably the best known salt lake is the Great Salt Lake in Utah. How is a lake like that formed? How can you get specific about that? You've already described a salt lake, and it was really nice. Is there anything specific about Great Salt Lake that you could tell us to set that scene?
Yeah, Great Salt Lake is the largest salt lake in the Western Hemisphere. Its historic average has been about 1,700 square miles, but in 2022, for instance, it went all the way down to 950, a little over half of its average size. And Great Salt Lake was once Lake Bonneville, so this much larger lake that spanned a lot of Utah and even into Idaho and northeastern Nevada. And when you're at Great Salt Lake, you can look around on the mountains that surround the lake and you can see like ledges where the old lakeshore of Bonneville was. And at a certain point, Bonneville was able to spill out of a larger valley. I think it went towards Idaho and just left behind what we know today as the Great Salt Lake.
Wow. I've never been to Great Salt Lake, but recently I was in Death Valley. We were doing an episode on Death Valley National Park, and I went down to the salt flats at Badwater Basin. And so I can picture what you're talking about. There's some similarities, are there?
Absolutely, yeah. Badwater Basin is also a closed basin, and recently, this past year, it had an ephemeral salt lake form. So there was a big atmospheric river or series of atmospheric rivers that came through California, and it filled Badwater Basin, which almost never happens. And that's known as an ephemeral salt lake. So in these closed basins, sometimes with big rainstorms, they'll fill and then it'll evaporate.
When we got there, someone was talking about this ephemeral lake in Death Valley. The wind had actually moved it. I was like, what?
That's amazing.
It had actually shifted positions of the lake because the wind was so strong coming through that valley. It is otherworldly when you picture places like that, and it's hard to picture a little bird even existing, or never mind relying on a place so harsh. Yeah. One of the species that you focus on in your writing is the Wilson's Phalarope. I'm sure most people have probably never heard of a Wilson's Phalarope. Can you just give us a brief description? It
is gray and white, and then it has a very beautiful kind of peach-colored ruddy neck. And it's an interesting bird in the bird world because, whereas we're taught that in general, males are the brighter, bigger, more colorful birds because they're attracting female mates. Among phalaropes, it's reversed. So the female phalaropes are slightly bigger, they're brighter, they compete with each other, kind of show off to the males, and they also take multiple male partners. So their sort of gender roles are reversed and unusual. And then once they lay their nest, they leave it to the males to take care of.
Really?
And they're unique because they are the only bird that migrates the entire length of the Western Hemisphere. So from Canada all the way to Argentina, stopping at salt lakes. There are others that migrate within North America, but none that get all the way down to Argentina.
You've just blown my mind with that image of a bird starting in Canada and ending in southern South America.
Yeah.
And a bird that weighs the same as 2 AA batteries. It's hard to get your head around. And so let's get to that. These harsh ecosystems, these salt lakes that we're talking about, they're essential for these phalaropes and other migrating birds. Why? Why go to a harsh ecosystem like this? What's there for them?
Well, the amazing thing about the Salt Lakes being so inhospitable and so unwelcoming to most creatures is that for the few creatures that do survive, they're just in utter abundance. So the two main prey objects that are at most salt lakes for birds are called brine shrimp and brine flies. And they're there feeding on like plankton and algae in the water. But they are two invertebrates that end up in immense numbers, like hundreds of millions of brine flies, hundreds of millions of brine shrimp every year. So for the birds that have evolved to like these creatures, which is not that many species, it's phalaropes and eared grebes and a handful of others that want to go to these salt lakes, they just have this all-you-can-eat buffet of prey.
Wow. That's quite the image. You describe them as fueling stops on the phalarope's migration. I love that. That really captures it.
When the phalaropes come from Saskatchewan to the American West Salt Lakes, they're there to basically just chow down for 6 weeks. They are there to molt their feathers because they're going to have a different plumage during the time that they're in Argentina for the austral summer. And so they need a safe place where there aren't going to be a lot of predators and where they can just get tons of food because they need a lot of calories to get all the way to Argentina. They will just be sitting there. They won't be able to fly necessarily because of their feathers changing, and also they double their weight, and sometimes they get so fat they can't fly because they can't get off the ground.
I have to admit, I geeked out on Google Earth beforehand and saw that they did this journey from your writing. That's 6,500 miles one way from Canada to southern South America, and that's just half their annual journey. Is that right?
It is, exactly. Yeah, it's over 6,000 miles that they go from Canada to Argentina, and they do it twice a year.
That's unbelievable. And so they really are relying on these salt lakes halfway through that journey to fuel up and make it, basically, right?
Mm-hmm. They're breeding at a salt lake, then they're coming to the North American salt lakes to have a safe place to get all the energy they need to make that journey. And then on the journey, they'll also stop at a few salt lakes on the way. So one, for instance, is in Ecuador. There's a salt company called Equisol that has these massive evaporation ponds, and those have some of the world's highest concentrations of phalaropes because they're relatively small compared to a natural salt lake, but they're just a perfect paradise for phalaropes.
It's so interesting how they're drawn into salty places, whether they're natural or not, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of impressive how these man-made, industrial salt ponds also can have an ecological function.
And these birds must be adapted for these salty places. Could you talk about some of that? How's the phalarope specifically adapted to live in salt?
Yeah, it's challenging because they don't want to be ingesting tons of salt. So there are a few different ways that they deal with that. One is that they have glands under their eyes to excrete the salts that they ingest. And then they also rely on the adaptations that the brine flies and the brine shrimp have. Brine flies have very specialized kidneys that actually get the salts out of their bloodstream. And brine shrimp, similarly, they can process the salt in their bloodstream, which means that by the time the phalaropes are ingesting it, they are not ingesting something that's full of salt. They're ingesting a creature that's actually processed the salt for them. And another thing that I should mention is that to get these creatures out of the water, they have a really unique feeding style, which is that they will spin around on the surface of the water and use their webbed foot to make kind of a vortex that'll bring the prey up to the surface of the water. And then they have a very long beak, and they will use that to kind of suction the prey off the surface of the water, because if they try and just grab it, you can imagine, this is the metaphor that Margaret Rubega, the scientist, used with me. If you're trying to pick a crumb out of your coffee or pick a little floating fly out of your coffee, you're going to keep missing it, it's going to go away with the surface tension of the water. So their beaks also have that problem. So they can actually suction a little column of water, and then they just make a very quick chomp with their beak and grab it out of the air. And then the last important salt lake adaptation that we know about, at least, is they have slightly thicker tongues than other birds. So they can actually press the water off of the prey creature so that they don't ingest all of it.
They press the water off. Is that right? Oh, we are just talking about such tiny scales here, aren't we, when you're talking about the surface tension of water and how a bird plucks its prey from that surface tension. We're talking a small creature. It's really endearing how you're describing them.
Yeah, I think they're really cute creatures. It's kind of amazing that something as strange and inhospitable as salt lakes can give rise to something as cute as the phalarope. I
love this. We'll get into that more, because it seems to me like you're the PR agent for the Phalarope, and the Phalarope is the PR agent for salt lakes around the world. So it's a lovely relationship. These tiny birds, they seem to have a really important role protecting these salt lakes. So I'll ask you about that in a bit. But first, I want to talk about the threats to salt lakes. Can you describe some of those? We talked about in the introduction that these lakes are drying up. What's causing that to happen?
Yeah, scientists calculate that of 120 salt lakes around the world, 100 of them are in structural decline.
Wow.
And so that's a pretty striking figure that speaks to really widespread ecosystem decline. And there are two reasons for that, two principal reasons. The one that historically has been the most important are water diversions. Mm-hmm. So in these arid basins where salt lakes form, because they're arid, it doesn't rain a lot. And so farmers need water to water their crops. And the way that you get that water is by digging irrigation canals from rivers to get to your crops. But those are the same rivers that lead to salt lakes and that feed them their water every year to replenish what has evaporated over the summer. And so over time, so much of these rivers has been diverted that water isn't reaching the lakes anymore. And so that's been historically the principal cause of decline of salt lakes. Now, of course, we are seeing the effects of climate change, and it's making it worse, and it's making it worse pretty fast. So you have the problem that more water is evaporating every summer off the lake because it's a hotter summer. And then also you have less snowpack falling, or it's variable year to year, but the overall trend is less snowpack is falling on the mountains that surround the Salt Lake. And that's the snow that turns into the rivers that feed the lake. So right now it's seeming like there's more human demand on the systems and less water in the systems.
It's a conundrum, isn't it? It doesn't leave much for the phalaropes when you think that this dry, arid western environment needs water for human requirements as well, right? The birds perhaps come second. It's an interesting story how they've stepped in to represent the needs of these salt lakes. You quote a report from scientists that say Great Salt Lake in Utah could be gone by 2028. That's only 4 years from now. What would that mean to the phalarope if they lost Great Salt Lake or the other salt lakes that they use?
Yeah, there's a group of scientists in Utah that call themselves the Great Salt Lake Strike Team, kind of, I guess, a name that speaks to the urgency of the research that they're publishing. And for the phalaropes and for some other species, it would be devastating because although there are various salt lakes around the American West, the Great Salt Lake is by far the largest, and therefore it's by far the most important for the migratory birds that pass through it. So in phalaropes, about 30 to 40% of phalaropes stop at the Great Salt Lake, which their world population is estimated to be 1 million, so about 300 to 400,000 phalaropes will go to the Great Salt Lake in the early summer. Another species of bird that depends on salt lakes is called the eared grebe. That's a little duck-like bird that has these white feathers on either side of its head that look like ears. And for that bird, 90% of the population goes to Great Salt Lake. And so it would just mean extinction to lose the lake. And for the phalaropes, it would mean a significant species decline.
Have you seen these phalaropes in the spring when they're in at Great Salt Lake?
I have seen the phalaropes. I've seen them both at Lake Abert in Oregon, and I've seen them in the austral summer in Argentina.
At both ends of their migration. That's incredible.
At both ends. And in the same year. So it could have been, the same birds. I was in Lake Abert last September, and then I was in Argentina in March, right before they start making their way back up to the U.S. That's
crazy. You jump on a jet, make that journey, and you've actually followed potentially the same individual bird that's flown that same exact route.
Yeah. I mean, I basically did the phalarope migration, yeah.
Wow, chasing the phalaropes.
But the cool thing about seeing phalaropes is they're so tiny that they fly in big groups. And so when they fly over you, they're in these kind of clouds, but the clouds are very clearly flapping, and you see this like white-gray oscillation as they flap their wings. So it just looks very delicate and ethereal, even though it's a gigantic cloud. That's
something to think about, isn't it? Each one of them, despite the fact that they're in this enormous flock, each one of them has taken an impossible journey to get there in an ever-shrinking environment when they arrive. It's profound, isn't it? Did it feel like it placed a personality on the backdrop of your writings?
Yeah, I think, it's always an interesting challenge to get in the mind of the creature, knowing that they have a very different level of consciousness than humans. But certainly to be able to picture some of the statistics, that if I saw a cloud of phalaropes that was, 200 birds, 400 birds, at Laguna Mar Chiquita, there theoretically are 500,000 of those birds. So they're just there in these immense numbers and represent this real richness and biodiversity to these lakes. And so being able to glimpse even just a small piece of it is pretty inspiring.
I want to combine now a little bit about salt, a little bit about your writing. You're working on a book right now that's part memoir, part an ecological look at salt lakes. And I'm beginning to understand how and why you're doing that. It's really lovely. In the description of your book, you wrote, "I only knew that as a queer woman searching for home in a world fast being remade by climate change, I kept finding my way to salt." I love that. What do you mean by that, finding your way to salt?
I started visiting salt lakes in my early 20s. I intended to visit one. I wanted to see the Salton Sea, which is in Eastern California. And then as I kept going on road trips around Eastern California and the Great Basin and Nevada, I just kept seeing salt lakes. And over time, I started to understand that this wasn't a coincidence, that I was in regions where they were full of salt lakes, but it still felt like a pattern that was really meaningful to me, that my life kept crossing paths with salt lakes. And at the same time, over the course of the 10 years that it's been since I went to the Salton Sea, my life was also changing. So I was documenting the decline of these lakes and the efforts to save these lakes at the same time as in some way they were watching me grow up, and they were watching me start my independent life as a young adult. When I went to my first salt lakes, I had a boyfriend from college who, is still a very dear person to me, but is not my life partner, right? And I ended up marrying a woman. And so I have this sort of life trajectory that has of change in my own life that's witnessed by the salt lakes. And so my book, which I actually just submitted the first draft to the editor this week, which is pretty exciting, is about both these efforts to document the decline and the activism around the salt lakes, and about my own relationship to the lakes as I was doing that reporting.
That's so interesting. So it really is a very personal but ecological look at this whole story. As personal as it gets, right? Your personal life is embedded in this story of the Phalaropes and salt lakes.
Yeah, I would say that the salt lakes have become a really important part of my life. And I think that, the more that I learned about their ecology, the more that I could see metaphor in it that felt relevant and personal to me.
What does your wife think about this connection? Does she get it, what you're trying to portray and reveal in this book?
I met my wife in Mexico City, where I was conducting dissertation fieldwork for my doctorate. And my dissertation had nothing to do with salt lakes. I was researching border policy and migration, human migration, not bird migration. But I was still interested in the environmental history of the region. And so I met my wife and learned shortly thereafter that she had made these sculptures out of salt. And she knew about all these salt flats that I had never heard of, like in Bolivia and Mauritius and Baja California. And she was showing me photos of them. She showed me her sculptures. And I thought this was just a bizarre coincidence. And then to make things even a little bit more faded, I learned that Mexico City is a city that was built on a drained salt lake. Now, looking from my vantage point today, that seems like the most obvious fact in the world. Now, of course, Mexico City is built on a drained salt lake, but at the moment I didn't know. And it was this huge sort of reveal that felt just added to this pattern of crossing paths with salt lakes in my life. And so I think that whether or not my wife is as obsessed with salt lakes as I am, she's part of the pattern of obsession.
She gets
and I think she
right?
does like them. She's been to a lot of salt lakes with me, and she does, when we moved from Mexico to the US, we drove through Utah. I was like, I've always wanted to see the southwestern corner of Great Salt Lake, but it's not really accessible to the public. There's no like visitor center or anything. And we saw this road, and she was like, go, let's do it. There was this dump truck full of Morton salt. She was like, follow it. I'm the most obsessed one, but I have someone egging me on.
Oh, that is the perfect partnership by the sound of things. I love that. You are literally chasing salt. That chase continues right after the break. And we'll learn about how the tiny Wilson's Phalarope could save these freakish salt lakes. Your article in High Country News focuses on the work of the International Phalarope Working Group. I just love that there is one of those. And it's a group of Phalarope enthusiasts that want to get the bird listed as threatened. And so if that succeeds, how could that help protect salt lakes?
So in 2019, a group of scientists came together as the International Phalarope Working Group. They're scientists from across the Phalarope's migration corridor, so from Canada all the way to Argentina, and they decided they were going to collaborate to figure out what was the status of the Phalarope at the moment. And that year and the following year, they did a big population count, and they discovered that the population had likely dropped by about a third since 1988. So it had been 1.5 million in 1988. Now it was about 1 million.
That's a dramatic drop. The numbers are still high, but the drop is astounding.
It's a very significant drop. And so that raised concern. And in 2023, they joined forces with the Center for Biological Diversity, which is a large environmental organization, to launch an Endangered Species Act petition to list the Phalarope as threatened, based not on its sheer population numbers, because, it's not a species in which there are 5 left in the wild, there are 1 million in the wild, but based on the imminent threat to its habitat. So the fact that if Great Salt Lake were to dry up, that could mean a die-off of 40% of the species at once. Wow. That's a big threat. And so the petition was launched in March of 2024. They're still waiting to hear back from the Department of the Interior. It usually takes about a year. But the idea behind this petition is that if the bird is listed as threatened, that kicks in federal monitoring and regulation at all the sites around the United States that are Phalarope habitat. So that would mean that Utah, Oregon, California, Nevada, all these states that have Phalarope habitat would be obligated by the threat of federal intervention to protect that habitat.
Right. Protect the bird, protect where it lives.
Yes, protect the bird by protecting where it lives, which would be really significant not only for the phalarope, but also for birds like eared grebes, like snowy plovers, which are suffering because of the loss of their breeding grounds at Great Salt Lake, avocets. There are a number of birds that stop at these salt lakes.
Reminds me of a parallel in my world of bears. Grizzly bears threatened under the Endangered Species Act, polar bears threatened under the Endangered Species Act. You protect those bears, you protect the habitat that they need and the locations that they need. They're like this perfect umbrella species, not to get into a PR campaign for bears, which I will if you let me. Very similar, though, parallel story, right? Protect this little bird and you protect everything that it needs, and ultimately the things that we need as well as humans. It's a really interesting journey. It feels like ultimately it's a cute bird that could protect something that's perhaps not super vividly attractive, these salt lakes, right? These freakish places as they've been described.
Exactly. Yeah, actually the polar bear Endangered Species Act petition was a bit of an inspiration for this Phalarope petition, because it was, I believe, the first time that the petition really had the threat to the habitat at its core rather than just the sheer species numbers. And so the Phalarope petition is doing a similar thing, saying the threat is not in low numbers of species currently, it's in this very big threat to the habitat.
Interesting. Okay, now I want to write a children's book called The Phalarope and the Polar Bear.
I think they would be great friends.
Well, you should write it, actually, yeah. Oh, a combined effort there. Yeah, I'll do the bear side, you do the Phalarope side.
Yeah, I don't know anything about bears, so I would need your expertise.
Perfect partnership. So just to encapsulate some of what you said, I read that the International Phalarope Working Group has submitted their proposal, and we're just waiting now, and it's on the feds to decide what to do. And there's no way to know how or when really they'll make that decision. My question is, what's the reaction been in Utah to the petition to list the phalarope?
At the end of March, the International Phalarope Working Group and Center for Biological Diversity and some other environmental organizations held an event called Phalarope Fest, PHEST, like Phalarope,
oh, nice.
On the steps of the Utah Capitol to launch the petition. They had people dressed up as eared grebes and dressed up as brine shrimp, and they had a marching band, and it was a really exciting event to show how much support there is in Utah for this petition. But at the same time, the reaction from many state lawmakers and the state governor has not been so warm. So the governor has promised to push back on the petition. I spoke over the phone with a lawmaker who said, we'll do everything in our power to prevent this bird from getting listed. And that has to do with a sense that, like elsewhere in the American West, they'd rather have the state be in charge of the state's business. They don't want the federal government coming in and telling them how to manage their Great Salt Lake, their ecosystem, their environmental problems. That's a sentiment that exists around the American West. Mm-hmm. In Utah, there's an additional layer to it, which is that, of course, Utah is the headquarters of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormon Church. The LDS settlers arrived to Utah in the 1800s, fleeing religious persecution in other states, and then in the process of trying to get statehood, ended up experiencing a lot of federal persecution, especially around the topic of polygamy, right? So there's a sense that the federal government is in our business, they're threatening our way of life, and these environmental debates in which the federal government is pitted against state management reopen some of those very old wounds in Utah. And so I think in Utah, the sort of general Western anti-federal sentiment is a bit turned up.
But is that offset a little bit? Did the Mormon Church arrive there and stay there and settle there partly because of Great Salt Lake? Was that a feature of why they landed, settled, and made that home?
Yes.
And so does that not make the Mormon Church want to do whatever they can to protect that lake, even if it's through a phalarope?
Yeah, I think there are definitely, as with many topics of religious interpretation, scriptural interpretation, there are multiple ways to see the Great Salt Lake and its religious significance to the church there. And many people see it as sacred. It was something that had an important role for the early settlers. There's an early story about there was a plague of crickets that was ruining the settlers' crops. And after a week of fasting and prayer, suddenly all the seagulls from the Great Salt Lake came and ate all the crickets and saved a lot of the crop. And so some people I've spoken to, some people I've interviewed for my book, they really feel like the Great Salt Lake has a sacred and religious significance to the Salt Lake Valley. It's part of the wonder of nature, and that's something that's really key to religion. But, another part of the Mormon history is that irrigation is really important. It's very culturally and religiously important. And so
what a conundrum.
Is the source of the water diversions that are affecting Great Salt Lake. There are definitely Mormon environmentalists. They're organized. They're working in Utah on the Phalarope conservation, on Great Salt Lake conservation. But the institution of the church is still maybe not quite as supportive, but it's starting to do some water conservation.
Oh, that would be powerful
kind of
if the institution of the Mormon church got behind this, right, protecting the Salt Lake through threatened species. If that's what ultimately happens for the Phalarope, what a lovely story that would be to tell.
Yeah, I mean, the church did a big donation of water rights last year, one of the largest, if not the largest, private donation of water rights. And there have been some speeches by church leaders about the importance of water conservation. So I do think there are some steps in the right direction. And a lot of the interviews I've done with folks from the church that see a religious importance to this environmental activism, I think it's pretty inspiring.
Just another moment about the sort of conservative leadership in Utah and the anti-federal government sentiment there. It's something I've seen a lot with back to bears here in grizzly bear country in the North Cascades of Washington State where I live. A lot of people who seem to be opposed to grizzly bears that I sit down and chat with are actually not. They don't mind the bears. It's the federal government they're afraid of, that they don't want in their life. And the federal government comes with the Endangered Species Act that the grizzly bear is listed on, right? So there's a parallel there, isn't there? It's interesting, the whole federal versus state, and how these species and protection measures are really measured in a person's mind by how they're affected themselves personally and what their political and spiritual and religious beliefs are. It's layered, isn't it? So layered.
Yeah, and I think that another dynamic in Utah that's part of this is that until recently, until the Great Salt Lake was really in crisis, even environmentalists weren't really paying that much attention to it. There were a few groups. There's Friends of the Great Salt Lake has been around for a while, but there's just been a flourishing of grassroots groups and activism in the last few years that really wasn't there. People, even environmentalists, they'd rather go to Moab than go to the Great Salt Lake, right? It wasn't one of the natural wonders of Utah in people's minds. It was, even in environmentalist minds, it was a little bit scorned, I think. That's been a really promising kind of development. There's been a really big upswelling of interest in the Great Salt Lake. In my article, I interview a scientist at Brigham Young University who's also a really important lake advocate named Ben Abbott, who says that the good thing about these petitions that take a long while, they can take a decade to make the determination, is that during that time, there's an alignment of interests. So whereas previous to the petition, it might have been that there was a conflict between activists and lawmakers or activists and irrigators, once there's a threat of federal intervention, the side that's fighting against protecting the habitat no longer can really keep that stance. They have to join the side of, okay, we have to figure out what we're going to do. If our goal is to keep the feds away, we need to figure out what we're going to do instead. And so there's an alignment of interest between the lawmakers, the farmers, the environmental advocates, and that can add up to really powerful protective measures. I was just going to
use that word, how powerful. That gives you hope, doesn't it? That alignment and that collaboration, it's what the world needs in general. Earlier in our conversation, you laid out the threats facing salt lakes. Don't they just need more water? Is that what it comes down to?
Yeah, an amazing thing, and something I think to give us all hope and optimism in the many environmental fights of our time, is that salt lakes are a really solvable one. They really just do need more water. So in the case of the Great Salt Lake, the calculation is that it needs about 1 million more acre feet per year. So the rule of thumb is an acre foot is 1 football field under a foot of water. So that's about how much more the Great Salt Lake needs per year. Other salt lakes need less. At Walker Lake in Nevada, they're trying to get 50,000 acre feet per year. That's a much more achievable number. And this is going to happen through a variety of measures, between state conservation programs, donations of water rights, like I mentioned, buying water rights from farmers is something that they're doing at Walker Lake, something that is starting to be done at Great Salt Lake. But the sort of amazing thing about these freakish habitats is that they can come back to life once there's water. So
really?
Things like brines. Yeah, things like the brine shrimp cysts, if at Abert, that when Abert went dry, the brine shrimp cysts can go dormant, and they can be dormant for years.
And what happens there?
When the habitat of a brine shrimp goes dry, the cysts that have been laid by the mother brine shrimp, which are little seed-like hard shells around the eggs, can go dormant. And so they just won't hatch if there's no water, and they'll wait until there's water again to hatch. So then once they do, they'll be able to attract birds again. So I think they're really remarkable if we think about in comparison to something like wildfire or climate change, where we really have to change so much of the way we live to be able to address these problems meaningfully. With salt lakes, really, it requires finding how are we going to redistribute water so that we make sure that enough water is getting to the lakes?
And what is the answer? How can we get them more water? How do you get more water into Great Salt Lake?
I think in Great Salt Lake and across the Great Basin, like in the Colorado River Basin, there's a low-hanging fruit, which is alfalfa, right? We grow a ton of alfalfa for cattle feed in the American West, and much of it is not even consumed by cattle in the region. It's exported to other countries that have already seen the writing on the wall about the water use of green forage for animals. So like Saudi Arabia and other countries have outlawed the growing of alfalfa in their own countries, and that's why they're importing it from Utah and Nevada. And I think that sort of questioning our own willingness to grow so much alfalfa is the first step in finding the source of this water.
The ironies are stacked, aren't they? It's unbelievable, to think that the alfalfa is grown for the meat industry, which is helping to contribute to the climate change factors that are affecting the salt lakes and the water and the snowpack and everything else. It's also interconnected, isn't it? And looking at it, does it sometimes feel to you that the solutions are obvious? Why are we not so implementing them? Has there been frustration in telling these stories for you?
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like, there's been frustration for me since I was like a 14-year-old climate activist. I think about the type of solutions that still felt on the table then, 20 years ago. I'm about to turn 34, and the type of situation we're in now, where today it's 106 in October here in Arizona, and it just seems like we're in a much worse situation than we could have been. So that definitely is hard to have seen. And one of the reasons I like to focus on Salt Lakes, because I do feel like it's definitely part of this general trend of the effects of climate change and human demand, but it's also something where it feels like it's solvable.
Solvable. What a great word in today's world. Related to that, and sort of the things that these birds and this journey, your chasing salt journey, what has this little bird and these freakish salt lakes taught you about our natural world?
I think that the Phalarope has lots of different lessons for us in thinking about the natural world. One, of course, is perseverance, right? That you can be a tiny 2 AA battery-sized bird and make it 6,000 miles twice a year. I think if they can do that, then we can solve climate change. Come on. And then, the other is that they really show us that if we, at first glance, think that a landscape is sterile or uninhabitable or freakish, maybe, in fact, it's actually very vital and full of life and important to the natural world. So I think following the Phalarope and seeing the way it uses the landscape shows us just how rich the world around us is, even when we think it's not.
Seems like this has been a revelation for you, this journey through salt and chasing salt and discovering who you are yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think returning to sort of the theme that we were talking about before, about the sort of links between queerness and queer ecologies and these salt lakes, I think that when you start to look at the world through those lenses, right, either through queerness or through biodiversity, they have this very similar outcome, which is that the world just becomes way more complex and rich than it was when you started looking at the world, right? It really just sort of expands the amount of possibilities that are in the world, both for sort of human life and for creature life and ecological life. And so I think, that's a wonderful thing about the world, and that's the thing that we are protecting if we're protecting a landscape like salt lakes or like any other unusual and threatened ecosystem, is that we're protecting the richness and complexity in the world. And that's also what queer people and people who live in different ways, that's part of that richness and complexity. So I think that maybe you aren't obsessed with salt lakes, but every different type of life and habitat is something that's valuable and rich and worth protecting.
Beautiful. I'm so glad I asked that. We have so much to learn from the natural world, and it is such a place of comfort and joy and openness and love and connectedness and so many lessons from nature. I love how you've portrayed that. Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you.
Caroline Tracey is an environmental reporter and author who has spent a decade documenting the recovery efforts of salt lakes. She's currently working on her memoir, aptly titled Salt Lakes. Don't forget to check out our Instagram posts, always some enticing images and thoughts from the field. Find us at The Wild Pod and at Chris Morgan Wildlife. The Wild is a production of KUOW in Seattle and Chris Morgan Wildlife, with support from Wildlife Media. This show would not be possible without listener support. You can help us continue to create this special immersive storytelling by donating to KUOW. Go to kuow.org/donate/thewild. Thank you. Our producer is Matt Martin. Jim Gates is our editor. The Wild is hosted, produced, and written by me, Chris Morgan. A very special thank you for their kind financial support to Jill and Scott Walker, Rose Letwin, Ellen Ferguson, Anna Kimball, John Taylor, Paul Lister, Bob Yellowlees, Barbara Stallman, and Barton Brooks. Our production team includes April Craig, Marshall Eisen, Michaela Gianotti-Boyle, Tatiana Latre, Lucy Suchek, Kara McDermott, Amelia Peacock, Darcy Riggins-Schmidt, Brendan Sweeney, and Hans Twite. Our theme music is by Michael Parker. I'm Chris Morgan. I hope you're all well. Take care of yourselves and do what you can to take care of our beautiful planet. Thanks so much for listening.